The week Fiona Driscoll had spent 18 months preparing for arrived, as catastrophic weeks tend to, with something going wrong before she had finished her first coffee. She was 37 years old, executive director of the Northfield Regional Transit Authority for the past 4 years, and she had not reached that position by catastrophizing. She had reached it by staying later than everyone else, reading every report twice, and understanding that authority rarely announces itself. It accumulates, quietly, in the details other people skip. But the call that came in at 4:51 on Monday morning was not the kind of detail anyone could have anticipated. The central diagnostics hub for the authority's eastern line had gone dark. Not a partial fault, not a calibration error flagged during overnight maintenance. The hub, which coordinated the signal systems for 42 kilometers of active corridor, had returned a cascading error code that the overnight technician had never encountered. He had tried the standard resets, nothing. He had escalated to the senior maintenance lead, nothing. By the time he reached Fiona, 2 service vehicles were already sitting idle at the Thornwood Depot, and the morning commuter window was 83 minutes away. Fiona set down her mug very deliberately. She had a federal infrastructure review beginning Wednesday, 3 days. A panel of officials who had flown in from Ottawa would be evaluating whether the Northfield Authority warranted continued federal funding, or whether, as the board's current majority preferred to frame it, it was time to explore operational partnership models. She was not naive about what that phrase meant. She had watched what happened to the regional authority in Beaumont 3 years prior. The partnership model arrived, the routes got consolidated, the fares went up by 30%, and the communities at the far ends of the lines, the ones that could least afford alternatives, stopped being served. This week was not a review, it was a verdict being decided in advance. "Get me whoever is available," she told the overnight supervisor. "I don't care if they're on the approved vendor list, I need someone who knows this system." The name that came back, 20 minutes later, was Seth Drayton. He arrived at the Thornwood Depot at 6:08. He drove a truck that was not new, a dark blue half-ton with a lockbox in the bed and a small sticker on the rear window, a child's drawing of a house, laminated and slightly crooked. He was 42 years old, tall in the way of someone who had spent years folding himself into crawl spaces and equipment bays. He wore a worn canvas jacket and work boots that had been resoled at least once. He did not introduce himself with the self-conscious efficiency of someone trying to impress. He introduced himself the way mechanics do when a system is failing and time is moving. He looked at the technician who met him at the door and said, "Walk me to the hub." Fiona arrived from the main office at 6:31 and found him already inside the diagnostics bay, crouched beside the secondary relay panel with a flashlight and a tablet. Not the authority's tablet but his own, running software she did not immediately recognize. "How long?" she said. Seth looked up once, assessed her, looked back at the panel. "I'd like 40 minutes. You have 20. He had it running in 17. Fiona watched him work through the glass partition. She had been around maintenance contractors for 4 years. She knew the difference between someone performing confidence and someone who simply had none of the anxiety that uncertainty produces, because they were not uncertain. Seth Drayton moved through the diagnostics bay the way a person moves through their own kitchen. Not with the deliberateness of someone consulting a map, but with the easy economy of someone who knows exactly where everything is. Outside afterward, when the first morning service departed on schedule, and the depot supervisor exhaled audibly enough to be heard across the platform, Fiona found Seth loading his equipment into the lockbox. "The fault was in the tertiary handshake protocol," he said, before she asked. "But it wasn't a software error. Someone configured the system to read a false error code." Fiona went still. "You're saying it was deliberate?" Seth closed the lockbox. "I'm saying it behaved like it was deliberate. I could be wrong." He met her eyes briefly. "But I don't think I am." She looked at him a moment longer than she had intended to. Then she looked at the manifest her assistant Priya had sent to her phone. The week's schedule, already compressed by the morning's delay, dense with briefings and the particular performance of institutional confidence that federal reviews demanded. "Are you available for the rest of the week?" she asked. "The authority will pay the contractor rate." "I have one condition," Seth said. She raised an eyebrow. "I need to leave by 3:30, every day, without exception." She almost asked why. Something in the way he said it, not apologetic, not negotiating, simply stating a fact about the shape of his life, stopped her. "Fine," she said. She did not know yet that the condition had nothing to do with stubbornness, and everything to do with a girl named Ada, who was 8 years old and had learned to set her own alarm clock because her father had promised her, every morning since her mother died, that he would always be there when she came out of school. The second morning, Priya flagged something to Fiona that she could not immediately explain. Roland Cass, the authority's board chairman, had submitted a supplementary technical assessment through the board's administrative channel. The report, authored by a consulting firm Fiona did not recognize, concluded that the Eastern Corridor's core infrastructure had experienced accelerating degradation, and now represented a liability risk inconsistent with long-term public investment. According to its date stamp, the report had been prepared 14 months ago. Priya had found it because it had been quietly attached to the briefing package being sent to the Federal Review Panel, not as a formal submission, which would have required Fiona's sign-off, but as a supplementary document under Roland Cass's own letterhead. Fiona read it twice. Then she brought it to Seth in the equipment room, where he was doing a secondary check on the corridor relay systems. "I need you to look at something," she said, and set the report on the workbench. He read it the way someone reads something they recognize, starting from the middle, then going back to the beginning. "This assessment is based on inspection data from the old signal architecture," he said. "The one that was replaced 6 years ago." "I know. The numbers they're using don't apply to the current system." He set it down. "Someone either made a very significant error, or they're describing a problem that was already fixed and hoping the reviewers won't know the difference." Fiona said nothing for a moment. Then, "How do you know it was replaced 6 years ago?" Seth looked at the report. "The spec codes in the footnotes. They reference the original installation framework." He paused. "I've seen that framework before." She waited. He did not say anything else, but something shifted in his expression, not closed, exactly, but held carefully in place, the way a person holds something fragile until they find the right surface to set it on. Fiona's head of facility operations was a former RCMP officer named Hugh Tennant, a man who had the unhurried authority of someone who had spent a career watching people before he spoke to them. At Fiona's direction, Priya had asked him to run an independent background check on Seth Drayton. Hugh brought the results to Fiona's office on Tuesday afternoon and set a folder on her desk. "The surface is clean," he said. "Licenses, certifications, references, all solid, all current. But when I went further back, things get thin." His professional history from his mid-20s has 3 gaps that aren't accounted for, and there's a notation in a civil court archive. A probate filing from 11 years ago, under the estate of one Walter Drayton. Fiona looked up. Walter Drayton, Hugh said, was the lead systems engineer who designed the original Northfield Corridor network, the foundational technical framework, the full architecture, every signal protocol, every hub configuration, brought on in the authority's 3rd year of operation. He paused. He died 11 years ago. Heart failure. He was 54. The room was quiet. "He doesn't appear anywhere in the authority's official history," Hugh said. "The design credits went to the board's technical advisory team, which, at the time of the original build, was chaired by Roland Cass." Fiona stared at the folder. "Who has the probate filing?" Seth Drayton does. He's the named beneficiary. Hugh chose his next words carefully. And if the original design contract was structured the way I think it was, based on a transit industry retrospective I found from 2004, the intellectual property rights to the foundational network architecture may never have been legally transferred to the authority. She kept very still. That would mean anything built on top of that architecture over the past 25 years was built on a foundation someone else owned, Fiona said. And if Roland Cassie is trying to push through a privatization deal before the federal review closes, and the deal relies on the authority controlling its technical assets outright, then there's a problem, Fiona said. There's a significant problem, Hugh said. That evening, Fiona took a different route home from the office. She wasn't sure why, except that she needed to think without the fluorescent certainty of the building around her. She had pulled Seth's employee file on her tablet, and in the emergency contact section, he had listed a single name, Ada Drayton, 8 years old. She thought about what Hugh had told her about Walter Drayton. She thought about the way Seth had read that technical report, not surprised by it, but recognizing it, the way you recognize a lie told about someone you loved. On Wednesday morning, Seth was already in the corridor relay room when Fiona arrived at 7. Ada, he had explained to Priya when he called to confirm his schedule, had a class presentation starting at 8, which meant drop-off at 7:30, which meant he needed the back entrance code by 6:45. Priya had sent it without being asked twice. At 10:15, during a break between briefings, Fiona found herself in the corridor outside the equipment room. Through the small window in the door, she could see Seth on the phone. She was not close enough to hear, but she watched him. The way his posture changed, not softened exactly, but unclenched. He held his thumb up at something that had been said. He said something back, and the quality of his voice, even muffled by the door and the ambient noise of the facility, was different from the voice he used at a workbench. It was the voice of a person whose guard has nowhere to go because there is nobody in the conversation who requires it. When he came out, he was sliding the phone into his jacket pocket, and his face was settling back into its working expression. He saw her in the corridor and stopped. "How'd the presentation go?" Fiona asked. A pause. She got through the whole thing without looking at her notes once. What was it on? Migratory birds of the Atlantic flyway. He said it with a straight face. She's been working on it for 3 weeks. Fiona almost smiled. She sounds thorough. She's her mother's daughter in that respect, Seth said. And then, because the sentence had arrived before he could not to say it, there was a brief stillness in which both of them understood something had been offered that could not be taken back. "I'm sorry," Fiona said. "Don't be." He said it without hurry, without the reflexive deflection of someone trying to close a door before anyone looks through it. Marin was thorough about everything. It was the best thing about her. He looked at the corridor wall for a moment. Ada got the best of it. Fiona did not press, but she carried the name Marin for the rest of the afternoon, the way you carry a word that arrives in the wrong moment to be understood and must be set aside until there is space for it. The danger arrived at 8:46 on Wednesday evening. The Federal Review Panel's reception was being held in the authority's main conference facility on the 3rd floor. 40 people, most of them standing with glasses of something sparkling, doing the work that happens between official sessions. The building's secondary power relay. Not the main grid feed, but the backup system governing the elevator, the emergency lighting, and the server room where the authority's digital records were stored. Dropped offline. Not tripped, not blown, taken offline from an internal maintenance terminal that required an access code. Seth was still in the building. Ada was at a school friend's house for the evening, which had given him an extra hour, and he had used it to run a voluntary check on the corridor relay calibration. He was in the lower equipment bay when the secondary system dropped. He knew what it was before the alert reached the facility supervisor's radio, because he felt it, a specific change in the ambient electrical hum that the building produced. The kind of shift you only notice after a long time of listening for it. He was at the server room door in 4 minutes. The access terminal had been locked out from a secondary command, not in the authority's standard maintenance protocol, but in the original technical framework his father had written, the one never formally decommissioned because no one outside the original design team had known it existed. Seth re-enabled the relay from a backup command sequence, and the server room came back online. The digital records, including the original operating agreements and the founding contract documentation, were intact. When Fiona found him in the lower bay 20 minutes later, his jacket was off and his forearms were marked with cable grease. He told her what had happened the same way he reported everything, in the order it had occurred, without drama. Someone used an internal command sequence to take the relay offline, he said. That sequence is not in any publicly available documentation for this facility. It was in the original technical specification, written by the design team 25 years ago. Fiona sat down on the equipment bench. The reception 2 floors above was inaudible down here. The building hummed its ordinary hum. You know that specification, she said. It was in my father's notes. She looked at him. When he spoke, he did not pace. He stood with his back against the wall and his arms crossed, the way someone stands when they have been holding something upright for a long time and have finally found a wall they trust enough to lean against. He told her about Walter Drayton, about the original design contract, signed in 1999, in which Walter and the then nascent Northfield Transit Authority had agreed on a co-ownership framework for the foundational network architecture. A framework meant to protect the original designer's contribution in the event the authority was ever restructured or sold. He told her how, over the years that followed, Roland Cass had systematically reattributed the design credits, how Walter had been removed from the technical advisory role, how the documents supporting the original contract had been reclassified and eventually buried. Except for the copy Walter had kept, which Seth had found in a filing cabinet in the basement of his childhood home 8 years ago. He told her about Marin. Marin had been helping him compile the documentation. She was a paralegal, careful and precise, and she had known exactly what she was doing when she filed a Freedom of Information request for access to the authority's historical contract archive. 6 weeks after she filed it, she was killed in a collision on the Highway 104 bypass. The investigation had returned a verdict of weather-related loss of control. It had been July. The road had been dry. Fiona said nothing for a long time after that. You came back here, she said finally, to the authority. Not to take anything, Seth said. Roland Cass is about to close a privatization deal that will wipe out the original design contracts entirely. Once the authority's assets transfer to the private operator, his private operator, the co-ownership framework is voided. My father's name disappears for good, and the communities on the Eastern Corridor lose their service within 3 years because there won't be profit in maintaining the far routes. He looked at the floor for a moment. I wasn't going to let that happen. Fiona was quiet. Then she said, You have the original contract. I have the original contract, the design specifications registered with the Provincial Engineering Authority, and 12 years of correspondence between Roland Cass and the holding company positioned to acquire the privatized assets. A pause. The holding company has 3 directors. One of them is Roland Cass's son-in-law. The silence was total. Show me, Fiona said. He did. They did not involve Hugh immediately. For 36 hours, Fiona Driscoll and Seth Drayton worked in a configuration that had no job title attached to it. Not a partnership, not a formal coalition, simply two people who had separately arrived at the same problem from opposite directions and discovered, between them, that they held the pieces to address it. Seth had the foundational documents, the original co-ownership contract, the design registry filings, a chain of correspondence linking Roland Cassie's board decisions to the privatization timeline, and a set of board minutes from 9 years earlier, marked confidential but never formally archived, in which the decision to reclassify Walter Drayton's design credits had been recorded in language that was extraordinary in its candor. Someone had documented the deception with the confidence of a man who assumed the record would never be read. Fiona brought what only an executive director with full system access could provide: the current asset registry, the legal opinion on the authority's intellectual property holdings, and, most significantly, the original Freedom of Information request Marin had filed, which had been denied on a technicality, but still existed in the provincial records system, time-stamped 6 weeks before her death. Hugh came in on the second day. He looked at the materials laid out on the conference table for a long time. Then he looked at Seth. "You should have led with this," he said. "I needed to know whether the authority was already lost before I trusted anyone in it," Seth said. Hugh considered that. "Fair enough," he said. Priya arrived the following morning, reviewed the file in 30 minutes, and immediately began cross-referencing the board's proxy appointments against the shareholder structure of Roland Cassie's holding company, producing, within 2 hours, a document that made the full shape of the privatization scheme visible on a single annotated page. The Federal Review Panel's final hearing was scheduled for Thursday at 9. Roland Cassie arrived early, which was not unusual. He worked the room before the session opened, shaking hands with the federal officials, with the provincial liaison, with the 3 institutional representatives seated along the east wall. He was warm and practiced. He had spent 4 decades being right about which direction things were going to fall. And it had given him the settled assurance of a man who no longer needed to try very hard. Fiona arrived at 8:57. She wore a dark blazer and the particular expression her staff had learned to read not as composure but as concentration. Seth entered behind her, carrying a folder, wearing a collared shirt that had been ironed but was not new. Roland Cass looked at him with the mild contempt of a man who has never needed to understand something in order to feel superior to it. "Brought your technician to the Federal Review," Roland Cass said, his voice pitched to Carrie. "That's a new one, Fiona." Fiona did not look at him. She took her seat at the head of the table. The session opened with formalities: financial summary, operational overview. The room had the specific charge of people waiting for something they already believed they knew. Roland Cass made his motion 20 minutes in, a formal recommendation that the authority's structural condition warranted transitioning to an operational partnership framework, with a preferred partner already identified. The motion was seconded by 2 proxy votes he had positioned months in advance. Procedurally correct, built carefully over years. Fiona waited until the motion was fully stated. "Before the panel proceeds to deliberation, I'd like to exercise the executive director's right to introduce a material disclosure under Section 14 of the authority's founding charter, pertaining to new information bearing directly on the validity of the asset transfer the motion contemplates." Something shifted in Roland Cass's expression, not his face, something behind it. "I'd like to ask Mr. Seth Drayton to address the panel." Seth stood. He did not look at Roland Cass. He looked at the room, the federal officials, the provincial liaison, the journalist from the Halifax Examiner seated along the west wall with a recorder and a notepad already open. He opened the folder and set it on the table. Priya projected the documents sequentially on the screen at the room's far end. The original co-ownership contract from 1999, signed by Walter Drayton and the authority's founding chair. The Provincial Design Registry filing confirming Walter's authorship of the foundational network architecture. the probate filing establishing the estate, the trust instrument naming its beneficiary, the legal chain documenting how the co-ownership framework had survived in the provincial engineering registry through 11 years of authority restructuring because no one had ever thought to look there for it. And finally, an independent legal opinion executed by outside counsel 4 days prior, confirming that the co-ownership framework was valid and enforceable, and that any transfer of the authority's core infrastructure assets required the consent of Walter Drayton's estate, which meant it required Seth's consent, which meant that Roland Cassey's deal could not close. Roland Cassey stood. He spoke about procedural validity, about the need for independent verification, about the timing of the disclosure. His voice remained controlled. His hands were flat on the table. Seth said very quietly, "The system my father designed is the reason this corridor has run safely for 25 years. His name was removed from the record so that someone else could sell what he built." He paused. "That ends today." He did not say it with anger. He said it with the specific weight of someone setting down something heavy in the correct place after carrying it a very long time. Fiona then presented the second body of evidence. The correspondence between Roland Cass and the holding company. The board minutes documenting the deliberate reclassification of design credits. The falsified technical assessment submitted to the federal panel under Roland Cass's letterhead. The deliberate server room sabotage on Wednesday evening. Hugh confirmed the technical findings and the access log, which showed the internal command sequence, had been initiated from a terminal. Roland Cassey had been logged into that afternoon. The journalist's pen did not stop moving. When it was over, the room did not erupt. Rooms rarely do when something long hidden is finally brought into the light. What happened instead was quieter. A collective settling, a recalibration, the specific stillness of people understanding that the version of events they had been operating within was not the actual one. Roland Cass left the room with 2 individuals from the authority's legal team and 1 from the federal panel's compliance office. He did not speak on his way out. He did not look back. Fiona stood at the head of the table in the silence that followed and looked at Seth across its length. She had called him in 7 days ago because nothing else was available and a system was failing. What she was looking at now was something she did not have a title for, but she understood, with the precision of a person whose professional life had been built on reading situations accurately, that she had been wrong about almost everything she had assumed about this man, and that he had been right about almost everything that mattered. The story reached the Halifax Examiner by noon and the wire services by early afternoon. By evening, Seth Drayton's name was being spoken in contexts he had spent a decade carefully avoiding. He did not answer the calls. He went to pick up Ada from her friend's house and drove home through the streets of a city his father had helped make easier to navigate. Ada was asleep before they reached the bridge. She had one hand tucked under her cheek and her school bag open beside her, a permission slip for a field trip visible in the top pocket. Seth glanced at her in the mirror at a red light and felt the specific fullness of a person who has set down something very heavy and finds, in the absence of the weight, that their hands are free. The broader expectation was that a man who had just re-established his family's legal claim over a 25-year-old transit network design would move to leverage it, claim compensation, negotiate a settlement, position himself for something larger. Seth did none of those things. He met with Fiona and with independent counsel. He accepted the legal acknowledgement of his father's authorship. He accepted the restoration of Walter Drayton's name to the authority's founding documentation and to the provincial engineering registry. He did not pursue a financial claim. When the legal team asked carefully whether he wanted to, he said, "My father wanted the system to work for the people who needed it. That's all this was ever about." Fiona had been in the room when he said it. She had looked at the table for a long moment, then she had looked at him. In the weeks that followed, she commissioned an independent audit of the authority's founding contracts and ordered its findings entered into the public record. She established a bursary in Walter Drayton's name for engineering students from underrepresented communities across Atlantic Canada. She referred the findings regarding Marin's Freedom of Information request and the timeline of events surrounding her death to the Provincial Review Authority. That process was ongoing. She did not publicize it, but she did not let it rest. Seth noticed the things she was doing. He did not say so directly, but she could tell. The first time she saw him after the formal proceedings closed, it was a Thursday evening. She had texted him a technical question about a specification in the new operating agreement. He had replied, and then she had suggested, without examining the impulse too carefully, that the question might be easier to answer over coffee somewhere that did not have a conference room table attached to it. He had said yes. The coffee became dinner, and the dinner ran longer than either of them had planned. The second time was a Saturday. Ada wanted to see the Natural History Museum's new exhibit on Atlantic marine ecosystems, and Seth mentioned it in passing, and Fiona said she had been meaning to go, and somehow all three of them ended up standing in front of a 12-foot model of a blue whale, while Ada explained, with the authority of someone who had clearly done pre-reading, exactly how baleen filtration worked and why it was, in her considered opinion, more impressive than teeth. On the walk back to the parking structure, Ada took Fiona's hand at the crosswalk without announcing it or asking permission. She had the confidence of a child who has decided she trusts someone and sees no reason to make it complicated. Fiona did not say anything about it. She did not need to. On an evening in early November, Seth picked Fiona up from a civic function, not as a driver, simply because it was practical and they were heading the same direction. Ada was asleep in the back seat, bundled in her coat, her face turned toward the window. Fiona sat in the passenger seat, which was different from the back seat, and the city moved past them at the hour when the working part of the day has finished and the rest of it is still being decided. She looked at the streetlights for a while. Then she said, "I've spent 4 years treating this organization like a system to be optimized. Routes and throughput and funding ratios." Seth kept his eyes on the road. "I think I've been doing the same thing with people," she said, "managing them from the correct distance, never letting anything get inefficient." A pause. "I don't think that's actually working." He was quiet for a moment. "Then, most of the systems I've worked on failed because someone optimized for the wrong thing, made it more efficient and forgot what it was built to do." What was it built to do? Get people where they need to go, he said, reliably, especially the people who don't have another way. Outside, the city passed in its quiet November beauty, the bridge lights catching in the harbor, the last amber leaves still holding on along the waterfront road, the particular hum of a system carrying people home. Ada shifted in the back seat and made a small sound that was not a word, only the sound of a child who is safe and knows it, in the way children know things before they have language for them. Fiona looked at the road ahead. "Am I allowed to say I'm glad your truck showed up that morning?" The corner of Seth's mouth moved. "You can say it. I'm glad your truck showed up that morning." He drove without answering for another block, long enough that she thought perhaps she had said it wrong. Then he said, "So am I." The car moved through the dark streets. Two people who had each been handed an incomplete version of the same story, one erased from its origin, one positioned at its center without understanding what she had inherited, continued, without ceremony, the careful and necessary work of figuring out where they were going next.